The constitutional clash at the heart of protests and attempted National Guard deployments to Portland and Chicago. Bill Nye the Science Guy on, well, science. NASA proposed budget cuts and China's potential upper hand in space exploration. You've heard of autonomous cars. Maybe you've ridden in one. Are you ready for autonomous Navy vessels? Unmanned armadas for a new kind of warfare. We check it out. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Let me welcome you to the Takeout. We begin with James Madison and a point he made in the summer of 1787 during debate over the American Constitution. Why? Because it is relevant to events in Portland this weekend and Chicago today. Quote, "A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home," unquote. Federal District Judge Karen Immergut included that observation in the granting of a temporary restraining order against President Trump's attempt to federalize Oregon National Guard forces and send them to Portland. Judge Immergut ruled President Trump's justifications were, quote, untethered to the facts. The facts, the judge ruled, showed existing federal officers with local police can and have protected federal buildings in Portland, that summer protests had died down, that the threat of violence in Portland was manageable. But something deeper was at issue in Portland and other jurisdictions where the Guard might be federalized. Judge Immergut wrote that if the administration's sweeping definition of threats of future rebellion or stresses on existing federal resources were accepted, quote, then the president could send military troops virtually anywhere at any time, unquote. The gravity of that possibility led Judge Immergut to conclude as follows, and I quote, "This country has a long-standing and foundational tradition of resistance to government overreach, especially in the form of military intrusion into civil affairs. This historical tradition boils down to a simple proposition. This is a nation of constitutional law, not martial law," unquote. President Trump, we should remind ourselves, appointed Judge Immergut to the federal bench. Early in her law career, Immergut was part of Special Counsel Ken Starr's investigation of President Bill Clinton, a kind of calling card of credentials for young lawyers in conservative circles back then. We should also note that Judge Immergut also today, well, not today precisely, but right now, lectures at Stanford University. Trump not only criticized her ruling, but sought to sidestep it by sending federalized National Guard troops from California to Oregon, prompting a hearing late yesterday where Judge Immergut, before blocking that move, incredulously asked of the Trump administration, quote, "Is there any legal authority for what you are doing?" That question hangs heavily over Portland and Chicago, where leaders there sued to block the deployment of Illinois National Guard troops or the deployment of National Guard troops from other states. We begin tonight with Usher Karashi, who is covering the latest developments from, I'm checking my notes, Broadview, which is a Chicago suburb. Usher, what's going on?
Well, as you mentioned, simply put, Illinois and Chicago argue that the federal government is overstepping its authority, calling the planned National Guard deployment unconstitutional and politically motivated. The lawsuit claims the president cannot use the military to occupy American cities simply because local leaders disagree with him. The filings cite states' rights, the Posse Comitatus Act, for example, and the risk of escalating violence and not restoring order, Major.
And what is the state of play in and around Chicago right now?
Well, there's a mix of anxiety here. There's also some defiance. We've been talking to a lot of folks here, but city officials have been saying for days they've been urging calm, but preparing for the possibility that these troops could potentially arrive. In the meantime, protesters have been periodically rallying behind me. We're starting to see some people showing up here outside that ICE facility in Broadway. And Chicago police and other police in the area have been told to coordinate only as needed to respond to specific incidents, but not to assist in any of the arrests that are going on around these areas. And they're warning that a show of force, like more troops here in the area, could potentially turn these protests into outright confrontations, Major.
And very quickly, Usher, you're not seeing anything that constitutes widespread violence or protests that could escalate to something violent?
No, we've seen for the last 3 weeks or so, Friday nights, Saturday nights, protesters gathering here in Broadview in particular. And there have been escalations. We have seen some dozens of arrests over the last weekend or so, but they haven't been large scale. Again, this is a very small area behind me, maybe less than a city block. So it only fits a certain amount of people. But, you know, one of the developments that we've seen today is that the Broadview mayor actually has put a restriction on the hours in which protesters can come out here. That is now restricted to between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. So we may not see those kinds of confrontations we've seen in the later hours over these weekends. Major?
That's an important local development. Thank you so much for bringing our attention to that. Usher Karashi, thank you so much. I appreciate it. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson is here with me now. Jessica, it was a very busy weekend, filings back and forth. As I outlined, Judge Immergut got involved in this case, reviewed the facts, reviewed the existing law, reviewed the case filing and everything that happened in the Ninth Circuit with the federalization and deployment of forces in California around Los Angeles. Summarize the key points for our audience.
I think you did a great job of outlining this. So step number one was the first temporary restraining order that Judge Immergut issued. And this was in the face of a challenge from Oregon and Portland, where they said that the president, under this federal statute he's been pointing to, Section 12406, just doesn't have the authority to federalize the National Guard. Judge Immergut agreed, and she distinguished what was happening on the ground in Portland from what happened from where I'm speaking to you from, Los Angeles. That's in part because she had to, because the Ninth Circuit had essentially blessed the Trump administration's desire to federalize the National Guard as a result of protests in Los Angeles. She said what's happening in Portland is very different from what happened in Los Angeles. And so she said, while presidents get a lot of discretion to make this call under 12406, presidents get a lot of discretion to say, I'm unable to execute federal law through the regular forces, which is part of what the statute calls for. She says that's not unfettered discretion. So that's TRO number one, Major. Then what happens as a result is that the Trump administration says, okay, well, we have these federalized National Guard members in California. We'll just send them up to Oregon. That's where we get that late night emergency hearing last night. Judge Immergut sounded very frustrated with the Trump administration. And she said, you can't do this. You can't circumvent my TRO because I just told you the facts on the ground in Oregon don't allow you to federalize the National Guard. Don't now try and take members of the National Guard from other states to get around what I just told you. So that's what's happening in Oregon. And as we know, there's suits in other jurisdictions as well, all asking that same question. When does the president have the power under the statute to federalize the National Guard over the wishes of governors and other elected officials?
Because as the opinion, as I read it, Jessica, made clear, the judge said, look, you can have facts. You can have facts that are in dispute, but you cannot invent facts that don't exist, point one. Point two, you cannot use a bizarre or invented definition of something like rebellion, because the judge said the terminology that the president is using, rebellion, to define doesn't fit with either a classical definition from when the laws were written a long time ago or our commonly accepted definition now.
That's exactly right. So what I saw the judge doing is saying judicial review, number one, is possible. So she's obviously taking a look at this. The Trump administration had previously argued that judges couldn't review these decisions at all. Number two, she's saying, I understand that, as I'm of course paraphrasing here, but as an unelected judge, I don't get to substitute my judgment for the judgment of the elected chief executive. But then, number three, as you point out, what she's saying is she can still look. And so, while there's a lot of discretion here, what she's saying is there's nothing on the ground that indicates that those factual predicates are present that would allow the president to take this power to call into federal service the National Guard.
Jessica Levinson, always brilliant, always on point. Thank you so very much for your time. To the Middle East now, where Israel and Hamas have begun a new round of what are being described as indirect talks in Cairo, Egypt. Negotiators are expected to focus on President Trump's 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza. The president has already told both sides to, quote, move fast. For our conversation next, I want to bring in Aaron David Miller. He was with us last week. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Well, when we were talking last week, you correctly predicted, before we knew what Hamas was going to say, that Hamas would say yes, but. It has now said yes, but. How important is the yes? How problematic is the but?
The yes is important and the but is problematic. I mean, I think the real takeaway here, Major, is that are you a Star Trek fan?
Who isn't?
President Trump has gone where none of his predecessors have gone before him. He has detached himself from the emotional and political constraints that usually impact a president and prevent presidents from being very, very, very tough with Israel. And he has forced, even with the yes but from Israel, he has forced Prime Minister Netanyahu to comply. I mean, I've worked in administrations from Carter to Bush 43. No U.S. president has ever dealt with an Israeli prime minister that way, let alone forcing them to accept a plan which Netanyahu clearly would rather not have accepted. So you got two yes buts. I think there's a reasonable chance you might see a partial implementation, phase one, hostages back, an Israeli withdrawal. The Israelis will stand down to some degree in their major comprehensive military ops. Palestinian prisoners will be returned, and if the people of Gaza are lucky, you'll be able to surge humanitarian assistance, access to potable water, sanitation, medical care, and of course, food on a regular and systematic basis. But this ain't going to end the war.
Why is it not going to end the war, Aaron David Miller?
Because Netanyahu's objectives and Hamas's are mutually irreconcilable. Netanyahu wants Hamas eradicated with no influence in Gaza. Hamas wants to survive. Hamas wants the Israelis out of Gaza, and no Israeli government, short of decommissioning Hamas's weapons and getting a stabilization force on the ground with a different Palestinian government, is going to leave Gaza. And frankly, those issues are really heavy lifts right now. They're tethered to a galaxy far, far away rather than the realities back here on planet Earth.
Yes, melding Star Trek and Star Wars, as anyone suitably does in this context. Aaron David Miller, what should people watching this closely, or even casual observers, monitor in the next, let's say, 72 hours? Because the president says his patience is limited and he wants to see implementation actions.
I mean, I think it has to happen relatively quickly. 72 hours, I mean, it's been a week since Israel accepted the plan, Hamas a few days later. The deadlines have already slipped. Pressure on both parties for sure. Hamas is under great pressure. Even the Turks and the Qataris, their traditional patrons, have basically under pressure from Trump, pressured Hamas. That leaves the Iranians with a Hamas connection. And I think the military commanders who are now making decisions on the ground in Gaza are at least smart enough to understand that if they want to survive as a political organization, they're going to have to figure out a way to stop Israel's military action, get some humanitarian assistance into Gaza, get some prisoners back. To tell you the truth, I think if this doesn't happen between now and the weekend, next weekend, I think it's just going to be a tragedy for the hostages, their families, and the Palestinians, long-suffering Palestinians in Gaza. It's got to happen relatively quickly. And there's a moment here delivered by a U.S. president. And I think there's no, whatever you think of Trump, and I've worked and voted for Democrats and very different kinds of Republicans. He's done something quite significant here. Let's see if he can actually follow through.
He's certainly going to try, and so will his administration with Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, and others. Aaron David Miller, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Major, thanks for having me.
Back here in Washington, senators returned to Capitol Hill. No signs of a breakthrough to end the government shutdown. Our Nicole Killian is following the latest developments from Capitol Hill. Nicole, great to see you. To what degree have there been developments today outside of the "no, it's not my fault, it's your fault" rhetoric?
Well, I think the only development is that it's day 6, Major, and counting. And the question is, will there be a resolution between both sides? Now, a short time ago, we did hear from President Trump in the Oval Office, and he did express a willingness potentially to make a deal on this issue of health care when he was asked more specifically about those Affordable Care Act subsidies, which is really a key sticking point for Democrats. They continue to call for a permanent extension of those. They are concerned that when they expire at the end of the year, people's premiums are going to spike. And so that's why they have been sounding the drumbeat to get those extended. And there is some willingness on the part of Republicans to do so. Now, he also seemed to suggest that there were negotiations with Democrats on this issue, to which leader Chuck Schumer replied in a statement a short time ago. President Trump's claim isn't true, but if he's finally ready to work with Democrats, we'll be at the table. So, whether or not this is a sliver or a potential opening to get some of these congressional leaders back to the table remains to be seen. Republican leaders, for their part, continue to insist that a clean extension of government funding is the only way to go here. That's why the Senate is holding yet another vote on this resolution to extend funding through mid-November. They say they have nothing to give at this point. But again, we will see if the president's comments today move the needle.
Yeah, when the president says negotiations, Democrats, and health care, that suggests possibly something might be afoot, if only behind the scenes. Nicole Killian, thank you so very much. A perfect storm for NASA, facing budget cuts and now a government shutdown. Bill Nye and 300 advocates were on the steps of Congress today to try to help the space agency. The science guy joins me for more on that particular debate. From President Trump's power to tariffs to transgender rights, the Supreme Court returns, kicking off its session with news of a case it will not be hearing this fall. Plus, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's deportation case goes back to court. Why a Maryland judge says she may release him if the federal government cannot quickly produce its deportation plans. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to the Takeout. The judge overseeing the deportation case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia has denied the Justice Department's request to delay proceedings because of the government shutdown. Abrego Garcia was brought back to the U.S. in June, you remember that, to face federal criminal charges after being mistakenly deported to a prison in El Salvador. That happened back in March. Much controversy ensued over both of those events. The Trump administration is now seeking to deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia to a different country. Camilo Montoya Galvez following this for us. Camilo, always great to have you. So this case has sort of been in suspended animation for a while. Just catch the audience up on sort of what's gone on for the last month and what happened today that is potentially significant.
Sure, Major. Just to level set for our audience, there are two major legal battles ongoing in the U.S. over the fate of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who, as you underscored, is that Salvadorian man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, despite a judge's ruling from the first Trump administration that protected him from being deported there. He's facing federal criminal charges related to human smuggling allegations that he denies, we should add, in Tennessee. But the judge in that case, Major, has allowed him to await the criminal trial that is set to start next year outside of pretrial detention. However, Abreu Garcia, because he entered the U.S. unlawfully and without permission back in 2011 initially as a teenager, is also facing a civil immigration deportation proceeding before the Justice Department. And that case is ongoing, and it is set to be appealed before the Board of Immigration Appeals at the Justice Department in the coming weeks and months. In the meantime, a federal judge in Maryland is trying to discern and find out from the Justice Department, Major, whether the Trump administration, in fact, wants to remove this man to the tiny African country of Eswatini in southern Africa while this case plays out and before the criminal trial actually starts. The Trump administration has communicated to Abreu Garcia's lawyers that it does indeed intend to send this man to this tiny African kingdom, but during this hearing, the judge expressed real concerns, Major, and frustrations about their inability to answer basic questions about these plans and how quickly they could send this man to Africa in the coming days and weeks. And so this case will continue to be litigated, and there's now a hearing on Friday as to the next steps in this case.
And the word vindictive came up in the proceedings today, if I had that correct, Camilo. That is to say, those representing the interests of Kilmar Abrego Garcia thought within the administration's deportation efforts there was something vindictive or punitive.
That is absolutely correct, Major. Lawyers for Abreu Garcia have alleged over the past few months that the only reason the Justice Department filed criminal charges against their clients is because they had to admit that they made a legal mistake in deporting him to El Salvador, and they only were able to really discover this derogatory information after that deportation, and that the prosecution, they allege, is vindictive and a form of punishment and retaliation against their client. A judge in Tennessee, a federal judge, has allowed that vindictive allegation to be explored through a discovery process that will continue in the ensuing weeks and months, Major.
Catching us up on all the relevant details, as he always does, Camilo Montoya Galvez. Thank you so very much. Still to come, the Supreme Court returns. New term, why presidential powers will loom quite large on the court's docket. That's next, right here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Thank you for hanging out with us. Here is a look at what else we and now you are watching this evening. Former FBI Director James Comey's arraignment has been moved up. Comey has now been summoned to appear in an Alexandria, Virginia court this Wednesday. That hearing was originally scheduled for Thursday. Comey was charged last week with lying to Congress and obstruction. Supreme Court began a new term today, one of its first decisions declining to hear the appeal of Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the partner of Jeffrey Epstein and was convicted on several sex trafficking charges. Some of the victims, you might remember, were as young as 14 years old. Today's decision means that Maxwell's 20-year federal criminal sentence remains in place. I want to bring in Jan Crawford for more on this first Monday of October, which means the court is in session. Jan, you are among the most able and keen observers of the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Major.
What are you watching for this term?
Everything.
Okay.
I mean, the easier answer is, what are they not going to do this term? Normally, when the court comes on the first Monday of October, we'll have a couple big cases, but we may struggle to kind of say it's going to be a huge term. They've already set the parameters of what this term is going to be, and they're going to continue adding cases throughout the rest of this year. You've got major cases involving President Trump and some of his policies. In addition to that, you have a range of some of the most hot-button social issue cases that the court now is going to confront. Trans rights, gun rights, a death penalty case, a campaign finance reform case, and a challenge to a key part of the Voting Rights Act. Those are just kind of the social issue, constitutional law cases. But then you've got these Trump cases that have really divided the justices. And we saw this summer, they didn't really get much of a break. Usually they'll go off for the summer, the feelings and tensions will subside, and they can kind of come back in October and get along. It wasn't like that.
From a generalist perspective, which is what I am now, Jan.
You're an expert at everything. Come on now.
Presidential power, two buckets. One, tariffs. The other on executive power to fire those within the executive branch, and kind of a possible dividing line the court may draw between those directly related to the executive branch and those that have a quasi-relationship to the federal branch.
So those are the two cases so far
okay,
that the court has taken up this term. I think there'll be more. And of course, the tariffs case will be one of the biggest ones of the term, no matter what, and whether or not those sweeping tariffs that President Trump has imposed, are lawful. Now, these guys who are in the Solicitor General's office and are filing these cases in the Supreme Court are very strategic. And so they're only bringing cases to the court that they think on an emergency basis, that they think they may be able to win. And I think we can see in this tariffs case, they're already laying the legal groundwork for other ways Trump can levy tariffs.
If they're nullified by the court.
Correct. Like the court may look a little skeptically at that. So already you see behind the scenes, they're looking for other legal justifications for Trump when he's imposing these tariffs.
A couple of names to name check. Lisa Cook on the Federal Reserve and Rebecca Slaughter, who was an FTC commissioner.
To your point, whether or not President Trump can fire members of independent federal agencies that were appointed by Democratic presidents like Joe Biden. He's arguing that he has the authority to do that these agencies act like, executive branch agencies. And I think he's probably going to win those cases. Maybe not the one with the Fed, though. The court is going to see the Federal Reserve as different than some of these other federal agencies. This is a pattern, though. We've seen this from the court going back to the Biden administration when they let President Biden fire someone that President Trump had put on the Social Security Administration. So this is a court that believes that presidents have pretty robust power within that sphere of the executive branch. But if they start encroaching into Congress's power, like with tariffs potentially, then I think you're going to see some limits.
Or something as historically protected.
And we haven't even talked about birthright citizenship.
No, we haven't.
That's
we'll get
on
to
the
that
horizon.
The next time you come back, Jan, which I hope will be very, very soon. Jan Crawford, as always, thank you so much. As the government shutdown approaches its first full week, well, here's a question on someone's mind, namely ours. Who's to blame? CBS News poll is gauging and has gauged how Americans feel about Republicans, Democrats, and President Trump. Numbers when we come back. Welcome back to Takeout. I want to take you to the Senate floor where we are in rinse and repeat fashion. The Senate will be voting on the Democratic effort to end the shutdown. There'll be a Republican vote, and we expect those votes to be the same as always. Meanwhile, the CBS News has a new poll about who Americans think is to blame for the current government shutdown. You see the numbers right there. 39% Trump and Republicans in Congress, 30% Democrats in Congress, 31% both equally. Joining me now, national political reporter for The Hill, Julia Manchester, and Politico White House reporter Sophia Kai. So we're going to set this shutdown aside for a second because something's happened in Virginia, not to the governor's race, but to the attorney general race, that could have repercussions in the governor's race if it sort of catches more fire. Julia, Jay Jones, the Democratic nominee for Attorney General, pick it up from there.
Yeah, the Democratic nominee for Attorney General basically back in 2022 was texting with a Republican lawmaker in the Virginia House of Delegates.
Privately.
Yes, and basically was fantasizing and talking about, the Speaker of the House, then Todd Gilbert, essentially being shot.
A Republican.
A Republican. Yeah. So this 3 years have passed, and now we're in 2025. And just last Friday, these texts have surfaced. Yes.
And Jay Jones has acknowledged that they're real.
He's acknowledged that they're real. He's apologized. You have a number of Virginia Democratic leaders, including the Speaker of the House of Delegates, Democratic leaders in the Senate, who have condemned these comments, but at the same time say they're sticking by Jay Jones. Abigail Spanberger, who happens to have a debate with Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican nominee for governor, on Thursday, has condemned the comments, said she was disgusted by them. However, she hasn't called on Jay Jones to step down. What makes this a national story is that now you have President Trump, Vice President Vance wading into this race and calling on Jay Jones to drop out. So the pressure is really on Virginia Democrats as a whole.
As a kind of litmus test for what is your tolerance for even something expressed privately that fantasizes about political violence.
Absolutely. And remember, this is coming less than a month or roughly a month after the shooting death of Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist. So political violence is certainly really, top of mind in our national discourse right now. On top of that, you look at that poll that we just mentioned at the top of the segment, showing that the majority of Americans blame President Trump for the shutdown. That this should be an issue in Virginia that should help Democrats. However, instead, said, we're talking about this issue about text messages from 2022 about political violence.
Speaking of the shutdown, Sophia, the president this afternoon opened up an executive order session, as he sometimes does. Wasn't on the schedule, but nevertheless, he took questions and said this about where things stand with Democrats and conversations on ending the shutdown. Let's listen.
We talk about negotiations that we have going on right now. We have a negotiation going on right now with the Democrats that could lead to very good things.
Huh?
So
That's not the talking point on Capitol Hill. The talking point on Capitol Hill is no one's talking to anybody, and it's all just stuff.
I mean, look, I think the public talking point of Republicans, especially on the House side, is, you know, we're these tough guys, we're not going to budge. But if you go and look at who is having these bipartisan talks in the Senate. So Senator Mike Rounds, this is someone who is very close. Yeah, a Republican, very close to Leader Thune. The fact that he is having
these sort of exploratory, quiet conversations, right?
That means something, because at any given time, Mike Rounds knows what Thune is thinking. And
what we'll tolerate as a possible way out.
And what we'll tolerate, exactly. And President Trump clearly is into these negotiations. In fact, this weekend, he said, if the negotiations go sour, then we'll start the mass firings. Right. So
it's
you
a
know,
little
he
hard
signed
to
off
read
it as
exactly
well.
what's going on. Do you sense within the White House some probing for a way to resolve this?
There is, yeah. And look, J.D. Vance has said that he's had conversations with Democrats. We don't know exactly which ones, but you know, he spent some time in the Senate where he's introduced bipartisan bills, so he does have some relationships there. And I think, look, the time where it becomes, you know, push comes to shove is when people stop getting paid.
Right, which will be sometime next week.
Yeah, so Friday there are some agency workers who won't get paid, and then next Wednesday, active military won't receive their pay.
Julia, your sense of thing. One thing I want to point out from our CBS News poll, our survey asked, is President Trump doing enough to lower prices? 75% said no. And on the economy, disapproval 60, approval 40.
That's bad news for President Trump, someone who made the economy his top issue in 2024.
It may be a pressure point underneath all this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then going into the midterms, where you have Republicans wanting to defend their majorities in the House and the Senate, you know, if Americans are continuing to blame President Trump and Republicans, you're going to see that flip. Now, in Virginia, I'm going to bring this back to Virginia, Abigail Spanberger has been, the Democratic nominee for governor, has been talking about this issue, and it's worked for her in Virginia. But due to the recent circumstances, we're not talking about that anymore.
I buy all the candy here. I refresh this on a regular basis. It doesn't eat itself. Julia Manchester, Sophia Kai. Thank you so very much. Bill Nye, the NASA guy, why he is fighting to save the space agency from proposed deep budget cuts by the Trump administration. The science guy joins me next right here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Hundreds gathered in Washington today to protest against Trump administration proposed cuts to NASA. I'll get that right. NASA science activity. Leading the charge, someone you might recognize, Bill Nye. There he is, the science guy. He joined our show after appearing on Capitol Hill. Take a listen. Bill, you're here in Washington. NASA is your focus today. Proposed budget cuts. What's the deal?
So somebody in the administration wants to cut NASA budget 20%, and cut NASA science budget almost 50%.
You said someone. Are you not sure it's President Trump who wants to do that?
Oh, I don't think. No, I don't. Seriously, everybody, I don't think it's the president. The first Trump administration was all in about space. Right. We're going to go to Mars. We're going to do these great things. You know, something's happened in the last few months where they've reversed course, or worse than reversed course.
And the implications of the 20% and nearly 50% cut to NASA science?
Well, that the United States would cede leadership to other countries, especially China National Space Administration.
Which is very competitive.
Very competitive. Everybody, there's going to be what I'm calling another Sputnik moment or two when China National Space puts taikonauts on the moon in 2030, less than 5 years from now. For reals, everybody. And then this whole business of sample return, bringing rocks back from Mars that may bear evidence of ancient life. China National Space is going to launch in 2028 and bring them back in 2033. Meanwhile, the U.S. So, you know, I just carry it. Here's a replica of the Mars sample, rock sample tube. And everybody understand, if we were to find evidence of life on another world, it would change the course of human history.
Right.
So you say, well, how much does that cost? We're not sure. Never done it. Yeah. And so that is, I'll just tell you, I worked on cameras on Mars as long ago as 1998, back in the 20th century.
Yes, indeed.
And there has been no love lost between the Mars program and Office of Management and Budget.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Those guys have butted head and gals have butted heads for over 20 years, but this is a whole nother, as we say.
If I understand you correctly, Bill, the question isn't how much it costs, it's how much is it worth?
Woo! Yeah, yeah. It's priceless in a way, but NASA also, objectively, every dollar that goes into NASA science comes back at least a factor of 3 times. So if you put $1 into NASA science, you're going to get $3 back in the economy.
And you're going to get practical things that already make our lives easier and
global positioning, situational awareness, charge coupled digital cameras, mobile phones, everything is a result of exploring the cosmos.
And do you think the president, if reached on this, would change his mind or stop whatever's going on? Because as you said, and I documented it, many reporters did, Space Force and everything attended to that first term was literally rocket ships to the moon.
Yeah. So Space Force, everybody, Space Force is military, but that job had to be done. By some way, somebody had to do this, the job the Space Force is doing. But we're talking about civilian space.
Right.
Yeah. So this goes way back, exploration for exploration's sake. And the Planetary Society, I'm the CEO, world's largest independent space interest organization. So one of the founders was Carl Sagan, famous guy.
Yep.
Lou Friedman, who's an orbital mechanics guy at Jet Propulsion Lab, and Bruce Murray. Bruce Murray was the head of the Jet Propulsion Lab during the heyday of Voyager, that's still going with the golden record, and Viking, the first landing on Mars. And famously, people would say to him, why are you guys sending these spacecraft out there? What are you going to find? We don't know what we're going to find. That's why we're sending them. Right. And just understand, just the NASA budget is a sliver of the pie. It's barely the width of the pie cutter. It's less than 0.1% of the federal budget, and the return is extraordinary.
So actuarially, Bill, I trend old, but my audience trends young. So they may not know what you mean when you say a Sputnik moment.
Yes, 1957. So the Soviet Union put a spacecraft in orbit, an extraordinary thing, kind of a physics thought experiment at first, but it turned out to be possible. And then we all went outside here in Northwest Washington and watched this glowing light go overhead for a long time, several years after that. And this changed the world. It changed the way people felt about space, because the phrase you'll hear is the ultimate high ground. If you have weapons in space, then you could exercise influence.
Right.
And in a sense, not changing the subject from NASA, but space is militarized in many ways. You know, global positioning systems are military gizmos, and everybody talks about intercontinental ballistic missiles. And space has a lot of spy satellites and so on. But
we gather information and transmit information entirely in space.
All the time. We rely on space assets. This broadcast is going someplace on satellite, right? And that's a result of both military investment, but mainly, you guys, civil investment.
With Bill Nye, the Science Guy, on YouTube, or you can listen to it on your favorite podcast platform. As he said, for reals. After years of losing ground to China, American defense startups are now working to change how U.S. military ships are manufactured. Next, I'll speak with a co-founder of one company behind a new fleet of unmanned vessels. Fascinating stuff. Next, here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Welcome to the Conversation Corner. We're going to discuss some military innovation. Defense startups are now working to revamp the way the Navy operates, and doing so with unmanned vessels. My next guest co-founded one of those companies. Rod Lehman is the Chief Commercial Officer of Saronic Technologies, which If all goes well, by 2031, we'll produce batches of autonomous maritime drones for the U.S. Navy. Contract has a value currently of $392 million. Rob, it's great to have you with you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Saronic, what does that mean? Where does that come from?
So Saronic is a gulf in Greece where the Allied Greek Navy defeated the Persians in an outnumbered battle. The 300 in Thermopylae gets all the press, but the Saronic Gulf is where the magic really happened.
So I don't suppose you could have gotten a better headline out of Forbes magazine. It reads as follows: a gonzo plan to beat China with giant robot boats. What's the gonzo plan?
Well, we are focused on...
And is it even gonzo?
Well, we see it as an imperative. So we started the company 3 years ago in Austin as a maritime autonomy and shipbuilding company with one mission, which was to redefine what maritime superiority meant for the U.S. and our allies. So we're doing that in a very differentiated way with autonomous surface vessels. So we have everything from a 6-foot drone all the way up to 150 feet and more to follow beyond that. And we saw a decline in the shipbuilding industrial base. I'm a Marine. Dino, our CEO, is a former Navy SEAL. So we saw the decline that was happening in the shipbuilding industrial base, and we saw a need to bring a new way to solve the problem.
I came across a statistic, Rob, but 0.1% of shipbuilding is manufactured in the United States?
It's egregious, and the Chinese have over 50% of global shipbuilding capacity. So doing it the same way we've always done it, no matter how much money you throw at the problem, is not going to dig us out of the hole.
What do these vessels do?
Everything a manned vessel will do, for the most part. So we are focused on essentially being a Tesla pickup truck for whatever commercial or military customers need the platforms to do. So get the things where they need to go, when they need to be there, with the autonomy and the ability to work collaboratively to allow the mission planners or the companies to...
Is this about moving supplies into a battle space, or is it about being operational lethally in a battle space?
Yes.
Both.
We say we enable the delivery of user-defined effects. It's a little bit of a colloquialism, but think of it as you get to pick what you have this thing do. So everything from very mundane missions all the way to the highest end. And we're really focused on keeping sailors and Marines out of harm's way, but also augmenting the manned fleet, whether it's a carrier, cruisers, destroyers. We need to have them, but we need to keep them safer and enhance their reliability and
if
resilience.
I read the materials correctly, lots of different stories about this. You do so aspirationally at a fraction of the cost.
Absolutely. When you take a lot of the human factors out of a ship, so bathrooms, staterooms, galleys, it makes the ships radically more simple and allows more fuel, more payload. So we're able to do these new build construction projects in a fraction of the time at a dramatically lower price point, and leveraging additive manufacturing and new ways of assembling these various components, we get them in the water faster at a lower price.
So you have skeptics, and the skeptics point out the tests, as I've read so far, in bays or controlled environments. The sea is the least controlled environment on planet Earth. Very formidable, things corrode, all sorts of nasty things happen, especially the farther away you get from the safety of a port. How do you deal with all those things?
So you're absolutely right. Space, in many ways, is easier than the surface of the ocean. So we have on Corsair alone, our 24-foot platform, over 10,000 hours in the ocean and over 16,000 nautical miles traveled autonomously. So we are on the water 6 days a week to make sure the unexpected and expected scenarios that you come across in the maritime environment are things we've had reps and sets to identify any issues and make sure they're mitigated before we ever put a platform in our customers' hands. And we do that through exercises with our customers.
And I've got about 30 seconds left, but as I understand it, one person can operate several at a time.
One person can offer as many as you can put in the water at a time.
Really?
Most of our young sailors today are digital natives, and this is the same way they play video games with someone across the planet. So just like you're the head coach for a team, you've got your players on the field. They know the playbook. They know what their capabilities are, and it's up to you to give them a plan to go execute.
Rob, it's a conversation we're going to continue. I appreciate you coming in.
Thanks, Major.
Very much.
Thanks for having me.
Happy Monday, everyone. You know what we are? We're the Takeout. Relentlessly curious, reliably civil, occasionally clever. The Day Report starts now.